Hello, everyone, and welcome back to ChatJSB. And today is a really exciting one because we have one of the world's most up-and-coming young cellists with us, not just to chat with us here today, but because he is coming back home to Worcester. He's a Westboro native, coming back home to Worcester to play all six of the Bach cello suites. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But first, Zlatomir Fung, I just want to say what a pleasure it is that you're talking with me today, and what a pleasure it is that you are coming home.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so excited for the concert, and it's just really meaningful for me to be a part of this incredible 11-year initiative and project. So yeah, thank you.
And actually, you can confirm what I've been saying to everybody, that for us in Worcester, and Zlatomir knows Worcester because he was a winner of the Music Worcester Young Artist Competition several years ago. We're really excited about it, but I keep saying to everybody, I don't think you all get this, that musicians far and wide, when they hear about this project, first of all, they think we're absolutely insane. And secondly, they just think, isn't this amazing that it would happen? What do you think of this crazy, the complete Bach?
I mean, it's incredibly ambitious and amazing, and there's so much there's just so much music there, and so much of it is so incredible. And I remember speaking a little bit with Mr. Adrian Finlay about this. He was saying that it's kind of unique to Worcester, the fact that you have the resident chorus, and all these great vocal artists that would make a project like this possible, because of the scope of how much vocal music there is, and obviously the collaborations with all the other partner organizations. But it's really one of its kind, and it's incredible.
And to think that you're the one who's going to represent one of the most extraordinary chunks of repertoire that Bach wrote. And I should apologize, as I do to all of my instrumentalist friends, that I, as a choral conductor, we get half the repertoire. And I just think on behalf of Bach, I want to apologize that all he wrote for solo cello were these six suites. Can you imagine if he had just written so much more? I do have a question, because I know that for you, you're so lucky at such a young age to be launched on this extraordinary solo career. You're out there playing concerti with major orchestras around the world. Have you ever played continuo for a Bach cantata, or a St. Matthew Passion or a St. John Passion or anything like that?
I actually haven't. I haven't had that experience. I think the only work, like continuo work of Bach's that I've played is the third Brandenburg Concerto, which I did a long time ago.
Which
And
is and that's a different sort of thing. I'll tell you what, just to plant a bug in your ear, I think it would be extraordinary, because the cello part accompanying the recitatives of the evangelist in the St. Matthew or St. John in the hands of someone like you, I think it would just be incredible. So maybe one time in these next 11 years, it's a quirky thing, I've got to say. Playing continuo is its own skill, of course, but you're such a great performer of the music of Bach. Now, I apologize. I was somebody also who fell in love with Bach at a really young age. And I got sick of people asking, well, why would you do this? Why shouldn't you wait till you're 50? Which I think is ridiculous, because Bach should be dealt with at every age in our life. But I do want to ask you, it is a little out of the ordinary for such a young cellist to essay all six of the suites from such a young age. When was the first time you played all of them in a single performance?
so actually playing all of them in a single performance is relatively new to me. The first time I did it was last summer, in the summer of 2023. And, with each of the suites, I have sort of a different history. For example, the first suite, I don't even really remember learning it like intentionally, because it's one of those pieces that's sort of always there. And at the age when I was starting to learn Bach, I was kind of learning just movements at a time rather than the entire work. So I think the very first piece of Bach that I learned was the minuets from the first suite, because it was included in the Suzuki method, which is
Oh, you're a Suzuki guy.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, and I think obviously it's for me it's a huge honor to have the opportunity to play all six suites in a single concert. It's also a tremendous challenge, but I think one of the things that inspires me in that regard is I feel like these suites, at their heart, they're obviously incredible works of art, but they also have this kind of educational purpose to them, because throughout them you can see the evolution of how Bach is thinking about adding complexity to a single instrument, and the things that he's able to do in the later suites with the different tunings, and the last suite that involves even an extra string.
And actually, we will absolutely come back to that, and we need an insider's guide.
Right.
Before we keep going down that, because I want to talk exactly about that, about seeing that evolution.
Right.
I do want to say, not just to you, but to the people watching this, that one of our board members, whose taste I trust completely, heard you do the six suites, I think at the Breakers, that beautiful mansion in Newport. What was that experience in that space? What was that like for you?
Yeah, that was a fantastic. I mean, that was the first time that I had done it, so it was all kind of a blur, and but the space is beautiful, and it was a very resonant acoustic, which is of course always helpful for playing solo instrument, Bach's music for solo instruments. So
She said it was phenomenal, which is why I just jumped straight away on getting you to do this. Do you think, would most cellists have all six in their repertoire at some point in their career, or is it something that you would include one suite on a recital? Like, what is the experience for most cellists with these pieces?
yeah, I think it's probably changed in the past half century, because I think uh, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, it was much more common for someone to program like one Bach suite on a recital with other music. And now I feel like perhaps there's more hesitance to program Bach in that kind of capacity. I think that most cellists at some point have studied all the suites. Cellists who are serious and devote their lives to the cello. But there are practical challenges, like the fifth suite, for example, whether you're going to learn it with a normal tuning or with the original tuning, because it's kind of it can be a little bit inconvenient to be working on that piece while you're working on something else, because it kind of messes with your cello a little bit to constantly be retuning it. So, but certainly the especially the first three suites are kind of staples, and I would imagine that most cellists have played those and are very familiar with them. So.
As I personally love both period instrument recordings, and I'm fascinated. There are some pieces, particularly a lot of the piano repertoire, but the cello suites, people are sort of allowed to play those on the modern cello, which I find quite interesting. Other parts of the repertoire just are not really permitted so much.
Right.
But they sit wonderfully for the modern cello, except for five and six, right?
Right, right. Yeah, it's such an interesting thing, because for example, one of the artists cellists that I admire most in his interpretation of Bach is Jean-Guyen Queyras, and he is someone who's very familiar with the tradition of playing on gut strings and period instruments, and yet he still performs and the Bach suites on a modern setup. And I think that for those of us who learned the cello in the late 20th century, early 21st century, the modern cello is what we know, and it's what we feel we're comfortable with. But as you said, the music is so timeless that it's sort of it's not such a big problem to play it on a modern instrument, I think.
Well, and it's interesting where you are in your cycle, and I can't now remember if I said this, but you have just begun as a professor of cello at Juilliard, which is exciting. And having gone to Juilliard, you are of this generation. Juilliard, which for a very long time had resisted anything to do with period instruments, began to incorporate them into the program in Juilliard 415, a wonderful period instrument ensemble. think that the beauty of that, even if you don't dabble with it, is that I think that in this part of the cycle of period instruments, modern players do take so many things from the period instruments. And it's interesting to hear about this. Did you study with any cellist who does play period instrument?
Actually, not specifically, no. But I've been influenced by, I would say, some of the recordings, especially of Honor Bilsma.
I was going to say Honor Billsman, I think is probably the best of the recordings.
He's kind of the godfather of that tradition on the cello, at least. So
Absolutely. Which is very far from, I should point out, Pablo Casals. Have you listened to those 1938, 1939 recordings?
yeah, they're fascinating, and in many ways, I really like them too. I feel like what he's doing with the music is obviously something different, and he has a different kind of sense of taste about how the sound should be. But he, that's why it's so fascinating to work on these pieces, because it's like they're kind of like these gems that you can look at from any angle, and when you look at them from a particular angle, you see things that another angle might miss. And so part of interpreting it for me is like just choosing the angle that you want to explore in that moment, and not necessarily that it's the only way to do it, but yeah.
I
So
love that. And, just in case people watching this don't know, these pieces were not these pieces, which are the mainstay of the cello repertoire now, were simply not until Casals, at the age of, I think it was 13, and he came across an edition of the cello suites. And they were thought of as more etudes for the cello, right?
yeah, I mean, I think they just hadn't somehow made it into the repertoire, and I think his recordings were certainly a big help in disseminating the pieces and making people aware of them and how great they were. So
Do you spend much time thinking about the individual characteristic? I should say I've been making this Bach 101 podcast series so that people can know a bit more about Bach as we do the complete Bach. And I particularly enjoy talking about the suites, because if you don't know what an allemande is, what a courant is, all of those very specific dance forms, how much do you think about that sort of thing when you're playing these?
yeah, I mean, I have to constantly be humble and sort of know how little I actually know, and I'm still always trying to read different historical perspectives and learn a little bit more about how these dances would have been thought of in Bach's time. And I think it's so interesting. Sorry, there's so many different directions you could go in with this,
I
but
know, I know.
one of the things I will say is really interesting. Is one of the ways I've been working on the suites is studying the four different manuscripts that exist, because unfortunately there's no original in Bach's hand, so we only have these secondary sources, and they have certain discrepancies. And one of the most interesting things for me is the third and fourth sources are both like anonymous from the late 18th century. And the bowings in some cases are quite different than, like, for example, the Anna Magdalena manuscript. But in some ways, they're perhaps more helpful because they would reflect how someone 50 years after Bach's time would be thinking about these pieces. And so there are just all these different kinds of ways that you can approach like what an allemande would be, how a player in like 1790 would slur a particular figure in an allemande versus how they would slur in a courant or whatever. So there's just so much to be curious about.
Because I'm a total Bach dork, can I just take you down that road a little bit? Because I am very fascinated by what we know as reception history of Bach's music. What are the differences? Is there a sort of a general difference that you see in the phrasing by the end of the 18th century?
Well, I would say that, it's hard to know exactly, like, for example, with the Anna Magdalena manuscript, how much of it is error versus like actual intention. But I would say that her markings tend to be a little more arbitrary, whereas the anonymous sources tend to be more uniform in some ways. Like if there's a particular motif, the slur will be the same for the first and the second iterations of that motif, whereas it might differ for Anna Magdalena or Kellner, the other manuscript.
And of course, cello technique had it really evolved in those 50 years, didn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest thing was just the development of the modern bow, which happened around the 1780s, 90s with Tourt. So it's very possible that as those developments were happening, the new bows, the new kinds of bows, could allow for different types of slurring figurations, and that would have been more comfortable or less comfortable than what Baroque bows would have offered to the player. So there's so much to.
Yeah. And are you able then, you just say, I think that this particular bowing or this slurring works better for you as a player?
Yeah, it's all of the preparation is such a challenging balancing act of different judgments, because you have to give certain amount of respect to the markings that are there, but then also you sort of have to give a little respect to yourself as a player of a modern instrument, a slightly different instrument, different setup, and say like, well, if this is more comfortable for me, then it would sound better. And I think if it sounds better, then that's probably more in the service of the music. So yeah, it's just very, it's always a balancing act.
But you know what I love? My academic area happens to be the history of the HIP period, particularly the shift in the 60s and 70s. What I love is at this moment in the cycle, you are allowed to do that as a musician. Like we've passed that point before you were even born, where you had to be in one camp or the other, which was a real shame, because you can marry these two ideas. You mentioned Anna Magdalena Bach. So I was living in Australia when an Australian musicologist suggested that do you know about this controversy? So this musicologist suggested that she actually wrote the suites, which really is not, it's like a scientist not believing in climate change. Like it's a very small sliver of people who would agree with him, but it's sort of an interesting idea, right?
Yeah, I don't really have an opinion on it other than, I think that the six suites have a kind of coherence. So I would say that, they were probably all written by the same person.
And she copied a lot of his music. So the fact that it's in her hand is really immaterial. But
right.
we do like the occasional fireworks in the musicology world.
Yeah.
Can you, before we finish, in layman's terms, explain the trickiness of 5 and 6 and the challenges for modern cellists?
Definitely. So for the fifth suite, which is in this wonderfully dark key of C minor, Bach asks for the cellist to tune the top string, which is normally tuned to an A, down one whole step, which would make it a G. And this slightly altered tuning allows for certain chords and certain kinds of resonances that are very different than what you would be able to execute on a normal tuning setup. But the challenge of it is of course that now when you're placing your fingers down, you're hearing a different pitch than you'd normally expect. So you can get tangled up sometimes, and you have to go really, at least for me, much more by just the muscle memory versus going by ear. Whereas, in the other suites, like if you wanted to change a fingering in the moment on the spot, you could let your fingers follow your ear. But here it's in the fifth suite, I find that almost impossible, just because it's like if you try to search for the notes, it's going to be the wrong note, because you're hearing something different than what you're expecting.
Do you have perfect pitch?
I don't.
Oh, because that would be even more upsetting. I
Yeah.
would have thought. And I wonder if because that string is now under less tension, does it have a darker quality, or maybe not, that step doesn't make enough of a difference?
It does, actually, because the distribution of pressure on the bridge changes even with that single whole step down. So the entire cello is actually resonating in quite a different way. I mean, it doesn't like completely change the timbre of the instrument itself, but you can sense that the whole instrument is being affected. It's kind of yeah, it's just like it's a little jet lagged or something.
For people who are not brave enough to try the scordatura, are there additions that don't force you to retune?
Yes, there are. There's a version where you can just play with the normal tuning. Unfortunately, if you do choose to play with the normal tuning, there are certain chords and really, really amazing moments. Like even the very second bar of the prelude, like 5 seconds into the suite, you miss out on probably my favorite chord in the entire six suites, which is this just amazing four-note chord, diminished chord. And you're not able to execute the full four notes if you have only,
Oh, right.
only do three out
That's
of
because of the range. Oh, yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. And then,
exactly.
of course, the great mystery of the sixth suite that you need a sixth finger for.
Yes, right, right. So originally written for some sort of five-stringed instrument with an E string. I think there's some historical debate about whether it was actually a cello or not. It was possible that it was some instrument that was supposed to be held on the shoulder like a viola, but like a larger instrument. And there are a lot of great practitioners today who have recorded it and perform it in that way. Of course, if you're presenting all six suites, it's a bit impractical to bust out a different instrument just for the last one. So,
A viola pomposa.
right.
So,
So,
so what do you do?
we as modern cellists, we kind of we take it upon ourselves to make this incredible challenge and play the piece with just four strings, and that makes it actually in some ways the most challenging of all the suites. In itself, already, it's the most challenging of all the suites, just because the um, the intricacy of the chordal work and just the density of thought, I think, is the greatest of all the suites. But taking away that extra string, it's like you're kind of giving yourself some sort of handicap, and you can't. There's certain things that you really have to go up in the higher positions to execute, which is not really done in the other five suites. So that's a particular.
And really not done. You wouldn't find sort of thumb position in anything before what? Before 1800 or something like that?
Right. I mean, I think probably the first great practitioners of that would have been people like Boccherini, who wrote it, but they were writing in a different kind of style, more virtuoso evolution of the cello. But Bach wouldn't have been so familiar with that kind of idiom. It was a little later than he was
And
writing.
so where would you place so adding this handicap to the instrument and for this piece, where would you place it then on par with in terms of the big cello repertoire? Is it on par with a concerto at that point?
Absolutely. I think in the four-string version, it's the sixth suite is probably it's among the most challenging pieces that you can ever play on the cello.
Oh God, that's really great. I cannot wait. I can't wait to see that. That's really very exciting.
Well, it's I got to go practice. That's all I can say.
I'm in addition to being a conductor, I'm a keyboard player, and it reminds me of the Goldberg variations, which written for a double manual harpsichord are already difficult. And then you put it on the piano and you're like, oh my God, this is, yeah. And so it puts it on par with the 19th century, like a Tchaikovsky concerto, crossing all in there.
Yeah, it's but going back to that other point I was making, I feel like that's sort of why it's so fun to play the suites at any point, because it's always a work in progress, and the suites are teaching us how to be better cellists, and it's kind of we're always humble before the music.
But that is the thing. Sorry, I'm going to make this terrible interviewer to make a statement and ask you to agree with me. But from what my cello friends have said, like it's an illustration of something that is so crazy about Bach that on the one hand, his music is universal. So I can play an arrangement of a Bach cello suite on piano and it will still sound like amazing music, but at the same time, so idiomatic. Like, do you find that the cello suites sit under the fingers wonderfully for, even if it's challenging, it sits for the instrument?
Yeah, and I would say that also the one of the great characteristics of the suites is that they really employ the instrument to its fullest extent within the parameters that Bach is setting for himself, composing just for a solo stringed instrument, which is obviously a
Which is
big.
already crazy.
Yeah, yeah. And that he's able to create so much implied harmony and so much richness of experience is just magnificent. So
Gosh, you are making me very excited about this weekend. Let me finish with questions that I always ask everybody in ChatJSB. Very hard question. What is your favorite single piece for cello by Bach? And then what is your favorite piece that is not for your instrument, but that you love by Bach? So go ahead.
Yeah, well, so we only have the cello suites, but I guess I can be specific and say like what my favorite movement is from all the suites because there are 36 movements. I would say that at the moment I've always loved the gavottes from the fifth suite. I
Oh,
just
yes, yeah.
and harmonically so fascinating and rich, and the chord work is just it's incredibly tricky, but it's
I was
it's
going to
it's
say they sound really hard to me.
very dense. Yeah, but I love those. And then gosh, with other stuff, it's so hard to choose. I mean, maybe I'll confine myself to stuff that eventually I could play on the cello, which would be probably the chaconne.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
on a partita.
Oh, is there a wonderful version for a transcription for cello?
There's been a couple done. I haven't had the courage to approach any of them yet, but maybe one day. So
Listen, we have 11 years to go. So will you promise me that you will learn it sometime over the next 11 years and we'll bring you to Worcester? I would love to hear that on cello.
definitely, definitely.
And that sound that you hear is the head of every violinist exploding at the, at the audacity of a cellist stealing their very best Bach piece. But
Right,
who cares about those violinists, right?
right.
Hey, Zlatomir, thanks. So everybody who's seeing this, you must come out on the Saturday night, which is the 26th of October at beautiful Mechanics Hall, a perfect place for cello, of course. It's just an extraordinary space. Here's Zlatomir Fung. We won't be able to afford him within the next couple of years. This guy, his career is absolutely exploding. Come so that you can say that you saw him when. Zlatomir, thank you so much for your time, and I honestly cannot wait to see this performance.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and I'm really looking forward to sharing all this with Worcester audiences.
Exactly, homecoming. See everybody.